Well, good evening. Welcome back to another Q&A with Ryan and Andy. I'm Andy. That's Ryan. I suppose we should come up with some clever title or name for this channel of what we're doing. Thank you for everyone that submitted a question ahead of time, whether it be email, via Facebook, or giving us a call or in the store. That kind of led us to kind of narrow down this topic as best we can to say a recipe formulation type class. So this takes place of one of our most popular classes, which is how do you write your own recipe and where to start? I might have to bounce around a little bit, so Ryan's going to be kind of leading the charge on this one. If you have questions, please don't hesitate and drop them in the comments below, and we will answer them as they come in. Hey, Bill, how you doing? Thanks for joining. Appreciate it. That was also some nice fodder going back and forth on the under the post on the Facebook post, so I appreciate that. But if there aren't any specific questions, I'm going to turn this over to Ryan a bit, and we'll kind of go through a little bit of an overview of kind of the writing your own recipe. Then we'll go into some of the specific questions to do it that way, because this topic can go down a lot of different rabbit holes, but we want to make sure that we're able to cover everything from grain, hops, yeast. I think we're going to touch a little bit on water today, but we'll see what time goes. That tends to be one of the last ones. And then we'll obviously, hey Stu, how you doing? Hey Jody, how you doing? Nice to see you. We will then kind of go that way, see what time allows. We'll try to end around 6:37ish, depending on how interesting we are. But without further ado, Ryan.
Hello, everybody. I see my mom's on. Hi, Mom, and Bill and Stu. What's up, guys? So yeah, we're talking about recipe formulation, which is kind of my favorite part about brewing. It's like really the fun part to me is just coming up with blends of different ingredients to create new beers. So basically what it is coming up with a certain mix of grains, certain hops at different times during your boil or during fermentation or after fermentation, and then picking out a good yeast strain that works for whatever style of beer you're trying to make, whether it's traditional, new style, or something completely different, like a blend of styles maybe you can do. So yeah, it's the main 4 ingredients in beers: malt, water, hops, and yeast. So you kind of want to learn how to learn what those different ingredients do. Is basically what recipe formulation is: learning the ingredients specifically and tasting different grains, smelling different hops, experimenting, and writing down good notes. Just kind of keeping track of everything you do with every recipe that you may try, like a new hop on or something like that. I think taking detailed notes may be one of the most important things to learning how to craft a recipe. So basically, you can go buy the book. Like if you're going to brew a Munich Helles or a German Pils, for example, you want to look at the style guidelines online from BJCP. It's the Beer Judge Certification Program.
I'll put that up.
Yeah, so they set out the guidelines that go through every single beer style and what key ingredients are supposed to go into that style. They give you like a range of IBUs or color range or an alcohol range, original gravity and final gravity ranges that are kind of set in what that specific beer style is supposed to fall into. So if you're trying to brew for like a competition specifically, or you really just want to nail like a classic German Pilsner, go on to the BJCP website. The last time it was updated was in 2015. They reviewed all the style guidelines and kind of tweaked them a little bit and gave a little bit more detail on each section. So you can look that up at BJCP 2015 guidelines. So if you look at that, it kind of gives you a place to start when crafting your recipe. So,
all right. Well, we have a bunch of questions coming in.
Okay.
Do you want to fire off some questions, or
let's go? Let's do some questions.
Okay.
That's what it's about.
I like this question a lot because this is one of the ones that I always kind of struggle with. Is Bill asked, besides comparing recipes for a style, what are some good resources for learning to create recipes? I know you talked about the BJCP, but if you're just getting started in writing your recipes, that BJCP may not make much sense. I mean, how do you differentiate? Because when you read those BJCP guidelines, it many times tells you about stuff that you may not know about yet. So what are some resources that you think would be good?
Well, when I first started, I kind of used Homebrew Talk. It's a huge forum online for homebrewers. They have recipes in there for every style, and they're all kind of rated. Like there's classic recipes on there that have been rebrewed 1,000 times or more. Other than that, I think Brewing Classic Styles, a book by Jamil Zenishev, and I think maybe John Palmer is the other guy that wrote that book. That has an award-winning recipe for every beer style in the guidelines. So that guy, Jamil, that wrote that book set out to win an award for every style, and he did it. And he shared all of his recipes from anything like Irish dry stout to a double IPA or an imperial stout. So all those recipes in that book are great foundations, places to start. So I think a lot of breweries in the world, or in the country at least, in America, kind of use that book as somewhere to start, and then maybe try tasting some different grains, like maybe a different chocolate malt that Jamil used or something. You come into the homebrew shop and we have 3 different chocolate malts you can taste, and they all have slightly different profiles. And just by tweaking like this specific chocolate malt could make it your own house recipe.
And I know one of the things that I started a couple of years ago, using the BJCP guidelines, and BJCP stands for Beer Judge Certification Program. So they're the ones that kind of write the style, and then when you enter competitions, you're brewing to a style that they kind of set the guidelines. Is I started brewing through the styles one at a time. So there's basically 3 examples, 3 subcategories in each one of those styles. And I went through starting with style 1 and would pick a category and brew that way and read the BJCP description and try to reverse engineer my recipe based on what I was getting from the description. So it forced me to really think about, okay, what does a little biscuity do and where does that come from? So then I would have to go research that grain or that malt of that. And then I would then compare, after I wrote my recipe, to Brewing Classic Styles, just to see where I was, if I was in the same universe or not. So sometimes that's a fun little way to do it, is using that resource. It's been a fun project. It's been a little bit slower. Wine season tends to get in the way of my brewing a little bit because all my fermenters are tied up with wine, but that's another day, another topic. But yeah, that's a great question, because sometimes, even as we'll say, sometimes is brewing is your best teacher and just trying, but there's certain things that we'll talk about through this that will be the places you want to start. We have another question that came in. What's from Stu? What's your thought of using either a kit recipe or a clone recipe as a baseline to riff on?
I think it's a good place to start. All of our kits are tried and true recipes that we've brewed multiple times that come out pretty consistently good. So those are good baselines to go off. Clone recipes, especially when they're shared from major breweries. Like I know there's a Two Hearted one out there that's actually from Bell's themselves. There's a Pliny the Elder clone from
based on what
Russian
I was
River.
Getting from
so those are going to be pretty darn close to what they actually brew at those large breweries. And using their grain bills, usually especially for IPAs and stuff, I think grain bills not the most important thing for that. I think the hop schedule and the process and fermentation and avoiding oxygen is a little bit probably the most important thing for beers like that. But yeah, clone recipes and kit recipes are good places to start and riff off of. And like I said, just maybe try a grain from a different maltster that's the same color or same type of grain, and if it sounds different, try it.
Yeah, just go for it. I mean, that's one of the things, sorry, shameless plug coming up. That's one of the reasons why when we started Perfect Brew, when during our stead, we didn't do pre-box kits. We wrote our own recipes. So that way, if you took one of our recipes or something that we wrote and wanted to change it or experiment, you could. So where we could change things on the fly, because then we have a known recipe, almost like a baseline that we can then tweak and then do it that way. That was one of the reasons why we did that. There's a few others, but one of the other ones is take one of ours and make it yours and kind of learn through brewing and take what we know and kind of make it yours. And we love that. because that keeps things interesting and keeps things fresh. And then we don't have to think of that many names for beer styles, because that's one of the things we're not very good at, is naming beer kits. But yeah. But yeah, and then Dan Brugger also brought up another resource for learning some of those things, and that's Designing Great Beers is another great book, which it absolutely is. Dan, maybe you can help me out. I can't remember that is
Ray Daniels.
Ray Daniels, yes. Geez, oh, Pete, thank you so much. Shameless plug to Ray Daniels. I'm so sorry that anyway. But yeah, that's another great style. There's a lot of great books out there. Brewing's, I always say, is one of your best resources as well. Then you have another question, or you
got another question from Aaron? Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, if you have a recipe you know is direct from the commercial source, any thoughts on how you might need to adjust for a homebrew scale?
That's a good question.
That is a really good question. I think, in my experience, for the grains, which are maybe the most complex part of building a recipe, is like coming up with the right percentages of grains. I was gonna first mention when I started talking about malt is speak in terms of percentage instead of just weight. It helps, you can communicate percentages of grains across any scale of any recipe, really. So if you take a commercial recipe that may be brewed like 1,000 gallons at a time, or 550 barrel, whatever size brewery, if they give you the grain bill, they'll typically give you a percentage of each grain that's used in the mash, or a percentage of the grist. So by just taking that percentage and scaling it down, you should be able to just use that same exact recipe grain bill wise and just cut it down for a 5-gallon batch. The one thing that may be different is the hopping schedule on a large brew kettle, like at a big brewery. They get a lot more utilization out of the hops, so they need to use a little bit less, or quite a bit less sometimes, by weight, especially for the bittering additions. And as far as I know, that's mostly because there's actually a lot more heat generated in a large kettle than there is in a smaller kettle. So those hops see a lot more heat, and there's also a lot more available sugar, which means you get a little bit more bitterness extraction from the hops. So that may be something you may have to kind of tweak a little bit. Maybe they'll give you their total calculated IBUs for the recipe, and then you can kind of play around with your bittering addition and your later hop additions and try to just make it fall in that IBU range that they tell you that beer is supposed to fall in. Then water chemistry, they might be fun enough to share the specifics of that. Depending on the brewery, some use RO water and build it up from scratch, and others just filter Lake Michigan water, which is good. Yeah. So yeah, I'd say the hops you got to be a little careful with for bittering and all that, but the grain bill should just scale down by percentage. Yeah, some breweries will give you their recipes, as you said. One of the things that I kind of like to do when I first started out brewing is I would brew the same beer over and over and over again and just change one variable. Some people will do what's called a smash, where they'll do one base malt grain and one hop and kind of go through. It's a very monotonous, not super exciting way to do it, but it's a great way to see some of the differences of some of the different grains, or even getting your techniques down, which then can help you learn going forward. So that was one of the things that I liked to do when I first started, is I brewed the same beer over again, and I just changed the hops, or then I just changed the yeast. That's another technique that I did way back in the olden days when I started. So, yeah. Speak of the day, Dr. Sean, we were just talking about you. I'll fill you in later. Yeah, so we can get a little geekier about malt, which I think I have the most fun coming up with grain bills. And that's just basically picking out a base malt, which for extract, unfortunately, you don't have a ton of choices. That's where kind of all grain gives you a lot more fun ingredients to play with. It's the base malt, which is where all or most of your fermentable sugars that are going to end up being your alcohol in your beer come from. So basically you got pale malts, which are probably the majority of what brewers are using, and especially in America, it's just pale two-row malt. Really light color, but gives you a lot of fermentable sugars. Pilsner malts, which are lighter, a little crisper kind of flavor. Those are usually used in Belgian styles and lagers. And then you can get into slightly darker base malts like Vienna and Munich malts, which Vienna kind of is just a darker base malt. Can use 100% of it and make a beer out of it. And then it's going to be a little toastier and breadier and probably come out like an amber color instead of a yellow color. And then you get into like Munich malts, which are even toastier, like the next level after Vienna in terms of toasty. So if you can brew a beer with 100% Munich, it may end up taking a little longer to mash because there's not as much enzymes in that grain because it's a little bit it's toasted a little bit longer. So you might want to mash a little bit longer for something like that. But if you think about something like a Doppelbock or something like that, that's like kind of almost a red color. That's what you'd probably expect out of brewing something with 100% Munich malt.
I have a question.
Okay, what's that?
For our extract brewers, how could they go through and learn recipe formulation without doing all grain brewing? What would you recommend?
Well, you got a few extracts to pick from. Golden, Pilsen, Munich. There's more coming out now. So you can pick a couple of those, one or two of those as your base to give you all your sugars to ferment. And then from there, you can pick out some specialty malts to work around, whether specialty malts kind of cover your caramel malts, roasted malts, and then maybe there's an other kind of category that's basically your toasted malts or like Victory or Melanoidin kind of malts. So any of those specialty malts really don't need to be mashed, which is the big difference really between extract and all grain brewing. All grain brewing, you go through a whole mash process. For specialty malts, they just need to sit in water for 15 or 20 minutes at like 150 to 160 degrees. Leave them 15, 20 minutes to steep, and you got all the character out of those malts. So those you can play with as an extract brewer quite easily without taking an extra hour or two to mash and do the whole process.
It's a little more expensive way to do it, but it's a little more controlled. So you could really, because using those extracts, they're really kind of dialed in. There's not much you can do to really screw those up. I mean, you could then play with the smoked malts, the caramels, the crystals, the things like that, and really get some fun results. You can even do a bunch of mini beers with those, I suppose, and just change up one little variable to check it that way. I'm going to back you up. We have a couple questions we're getting here. Let me see here. So we got Aaron's.
Got that.
Okay. Should base types of hops on aroma and flavor profile alpha acids, or I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, so picking out hops for, I'm guessing something like an IPA. Alpha acid hops were kind of high alpha acid hops were really originally developed just to add bitterness to beer, but not so much green matter, hop matters. So those high alpha acid hops are more used for bittering, but now with all these new hop varieties coming out, the ones with really big aroma and flavor also tend to have higher alpha acids. So I don't really base my hop choice when I'm looking for flavor aroma on the alpha acid. I'd say if you're looking for a really punchy, aromatic, and flavorful hop, you can look at the total oils in the hops. That's something a little more important to look at, I think. If you look at spec sheets for different hop varieties, and it may vary a little bit based on different years of certain hop varieties, but you should be able to find a number of total oils, and it's like total oils grams per milliliter or something is how they measure it. So hop like Citra, for example, has like a 2 to 4% total oil composition, which is very high. And then there's something like Saaz or a Hallertau, which has less than 1 gram per milliliter, which is low. So I tend, when I'm doing an IPA, to look for higher oil hops like Citra or Mosaic or Galaxy. I think Galaxy has the most oils by weight. But I mean, if I'm just looking for a little cheap bittering or something, I'll go for high alpha acid for something like a stout or a porter where the flavor of the hops don't really matter. You just want to get enough bitterness in there to balance the sweetness from the malt.
I'm going to throw something up there. Hops are one of the fun things. And I was going to put you on the spot a little bit, Ryan. in Stan Hieronymus's book, which I'm trying to find the right link, you can mix two different hops together to get different flavors and aromas that kind of do things that way. Is that something that somebody that's just starting in the recipe formulation is going to focus too much on, or do you have examples of what two hops or what you may look for if you wanted to mix? Because what is it? You can do two different hops to get like an Amarillo type characteristic or a Citra.
Yeah, they were trying to come up with these blends. This is like 3 years ago at HomebrewCon. He was talking about it. So they were thinking there might be a shortage of hops that everybody wants, like Citra and Amarillo and stuff like that. So a company called Hopsteiner came out with these blending trials where they blend a couple or 3 different varieties of hops to create the same oil composition of something like Citra or Simcoe or Amarillo. So Stan Hieronymus, who's written a lot of stuff about hops, like very geeky, sciencey stuff about hops, which is very interesting, but kind of deep in the rabbit hole of hops and learning about them and stuff. He shared at that HomebrewCon we went to in Minnesota that if you use I'm kind of guessing, but it was something along the lines of 1/10 lemon drop, 9/10 Cascade gives you the same oil composition of Amarillo. So you can recreate that flavor of Amarillo by using those percentages of those 2 other hops. And there's a blend for Citra and a blend for Simcoe. And they've been tasted and done taste trials and stuff, and they all kind of came across as the same as what the hops they're trying to mimic for those specific blends, which is kind of interesting.
I'll post that link later. I'm having a hard time finding it, a good one, and still reaching across. But yes, I don't know if that answered your question there, because hops can do some really fun things. I didn't mean to put you on the spot because that's something I've never tried, but I know it exists. I don't know how many people actually do that.
On a homebrew scale, it's kind of tough. You'd have to buy like an ounce of lemon drop just to use 1/10 of it or something.
That does make it tough. But one of our other questions we have here from Sean Walker here is constants versus variables. Brewing is specific, or is it nothing? There's a lot this is where we could say the old adage is it depends. Constants are, I don't even know where to begin. There's so many things we could talk about. So when we talk about brewing, there's probably in our grain room right now, probably close to 200 varieties of grains that you can pick from, and maybe 10 different base malts to kind of build your recipes. There's probably 40 to 50% of adjuncts or specialty malts, we'll say, that you can add different colors, aromas, flavors, mouthfeel, body. Then there's all the adjuncts, which can add another layer of things. There's so many variables.
They're all variables for ingredients, at least. They're all agricultural products, hops and grain. Grain tends to be a little more consistent from year to year, year round. I've noticed little things with our like UK malt. Maris Otter has been coming in a little bit smaller the past couple of years. Just the kernel altogether is just a little smaller, so it's not crushing as fine through our mill. That's kind of what I kind of noticed first. Yep. But it still has pretty much the same flavor and all that. It's just something we have to focus on when we're milling it to make sure it gets crushed properly. Yeah,
there's even different parts of the year, different lots that we would get a certain Pilsner malt from a certain German maltster that would take forever to mill. It didn't happen as often. Thank you, Aaron. That's what I was looking for. But yeah, that was so the grains do change, but they're probably the most consistent. That's a really good question, but it's a really tough one to answer in under an hour, I would say, because there's so many constants, so many variables that you can play with. It's almost a constant change. That's what really makes really good brewers is they can do the same beer over and over and over again, and it's going to taste exactly the same. That's what makes the big breweries so kind of amazing, as much as we love to dog them, but they can make that same beer anywhere in the world and it's going to taste the same no matter what. So that's quite remarkable to be able to control the little yeasties in the process that much to where you can have that kind of replication at that size of scale. So that's what, that it's amazing to me that way. And apparently I apologize for a little bit of noise we had on our, somehow Siri picked up and wanted to find something for me that I'm not sure exactly what she was looking for, but hopefully it's gone now. Some of the other questions we had, I don't know. This topic is so huge; it can go in so many different directions. Hopefully we're keeping people engaged with this one because we can. This is such a rabbit hole to go down as far as super techie, nerdy, and it's very exciting. This is what we spend most of our days talking about. A lot of our customers that come in as we talk about things like this, but maybe it's one topic for 20, 30 minutes at one time. But anyway, we do have another question that was emailed into us. This is from Dan. How do you dial in hop addition amounts, addition times, and method, dry hop, whirlpool, hop stand, and boil, particularly when attempting to adjust flavor and aroma, particularly in IPAs from either coast? Does that make sense? You read my...
Yeah, it's always experimenting. I think I've tried lots of different hop addition amounts, times. It's kind of it does depend on which coast type of IPA you're looking for. If you're looking for a New England style or a West Coast.
What are the differences in coasts?
There's East Coast or New England style IPAs, or some people just call them hazies. They're cloudy, hazy, juicy, low bitterness. And then there's the West Coast style, which was around earlier, probably in the early 2000s when it started becoming a thing. That's got a little bit of a darker malt character to it, just a little. It doesn't have to, but a lot of breweries use a little caramel malt in there to give it some color and just a touch of sweetness. They tend to be much higher in bitterness and more like resiny, piney kind of hop flavor, kind of like the classic Pacific Northwest hops like Cascade, Centennial, and Chinook. Whereas these New England styles are using the even newer hops like Mosaic and Citra are kind of the two main ones.
They're delicious.
So yeah, they're just, it's really a bitterness difference. West Coasts are clear, supposed to be very clear. New England's are cloudy, supposed to look like orange juice pretty much.
It tastes like it sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So dialing in hop additions does depend on, in IPAs, depends on if you're going for a West Coast or a New England. New England's, in my experience, are a little easier to get the flavor. I tend to just do like a tiny bittering addition of just a 1/4 ounce of something just to put some hops in the boil and give it maybe 5 to 10 IBUs. And then I boil for my normal hour or so and then do a little hop addition at the end of the boil called a hop stand. Right at the end, turn the heat off and throw in 2 or 3 ounces of hops and let them steep for 10 minutes. Probably get another 20, 30 IBUs there. And then I like to put my immersion chiller in and cool down to 160, 170, and then throw another 2 or 3 ounces of good fruity hops in there and let those steep for another 10 or 15 or even 20 minutes. And that lower temperature is not going to extract really much bitterness, maybe a little bit, but not nearly as much as a boiled addition. So by doing that, you get less bitterness and you just get all those hop oils to absorb into the wort, giving you kind of a juicier kind of flavor. And then you just do lots and lots of dry hopping during and after fermentation. For West Coast, I find those a little bit trickier to kind of nail. I like a bigger hop addition in the beginning, but I really like to give it like a 20 and 10-minute addition too. Just kind of layer in kind of the more old school hops during the boil, like Centennial, Simcoe, and Chinook, like in those later hop additions, like 20 to 0 minutes, tends to give you a little more of that resiny kind of piney flavor. And then I still like to do like a late hop stand with the heat off in a West Coast IPA. And then I'll let it ferment nice and clean and then do a relatively large dry hop 3 or 4 days before I'm going to keg the beer or bottle, ideally kegging for IPAs. So just playing with those different timings on specific hop varieties and see what they do when they're sitting in hot wort as opposed to dry hop. You get different flavors even from the same variety, whether that hop gets really hot and boiled or if it's dry hopped with. So take lots of notes with that stuff.
Which really dictates. We get a lot of people that we talk to just out and about that say they don't like hoppy beers. And we, of course, being beer connoisseurs or things like that, we say, what do you mean you don't like hoppy beers? You don't like beers with bitterness, aroma, or flavor. And kind of what Ryan was just talking about, when you add those hops will dictate what characteristics you get even from the same hop. So
yeah.
There's a lot of questions, so I apologize. We're trying to keep up with them. Someone said, yeah, we should definitely do a live brew. There's a lot of downtime. We did one with my alma mater where we did a 20-minute boil, which if we can try that again. If enough people ask for that, we will absolutely probably do another 20-minute boil. I don't have that many things to say when we're actually doing an hour boil. There's a lot of standing around watching the water do stuff, but I like that idea, maybe coming to a channel near you. Ryan, this is another question from Aaron. You mentioned using any high alpha hop for bittering. Just stock up on Magnum?
Yeah, pretty much. If you're just going to do, I mean, Magnum works great in any style. I think it's just very soft bitterness and high alpha. So I like Columbus a lot too.
Yeah, I'll sometimes use Hercules just because you don't use it as much. And then forgive me if you talked about first wort hopping, that I've started to swear by first wort hopping for a nice soft bitterness. So
yeah, I think I do that on everything now.
Yeah, where basically first wort hopping is you just toss some hops in when you're transferring over from your mash tun into your boil kettle. So, but excuse me, I'll be right back.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, Magnum's great. Columbus, anything that's cheap, like Columbus is cheap and it's really clean, really high alpha. So just the less you have to use early on in the boil to get the IBUs you're looking for, I think the better it is, because there's less hop material to worry about going into your fermenter and making the beer turn grassy or anything like that. So Tom Manning has another question. I can't seem to adjust for boil off rates in a robo brew. Like a 60-minute hop addition might be longer. I can't figure it out. So adjusting boil off rate can it can depend on a few things. The robo brew I've never used. I imagine it's got like what, an 18-inch opening, so that has something to do with the boil off rate. I think the best way to learn your boil off rate should be just to boil some water, put 5 gallons in, boil it for an hour, and then measure what's left over. Robo brews may not get as vigorous of a boil as something like a propane burner. I know on our Blickman burner here, depending on how high I turn it, I usually just go medium heat and it boils off about a gallon per hour. Sometimes a little bit more, but it depends on the diameter of the kettle you're boiling in and basically how much heat you're putting on there. But I've heard some people on those electric breweries, all-in-one brewing systems, only boil off about a half a gallon per hour, whereas my system on the propane here is like 1 to 1.5 gallons. So that's just something, it's one of the very many things you'd have to learn to adjust based on experience and from batch to batch, take notes. That's another thing you got to take. I recommend taking notes on, because with that, you can more easily predict your efficiencies and other stuff like that and learn how to tweak your grain bills to hit the exact gravities that you're looking for. So Angela here has a question. Our hazy recipe is delicious. It's the kit's name is DDH Perfectly Hazy. That is like probably our best-selling kit of the past 2 years that we put it out. I think 2 years ago. We originally just put out Perfectly Hazy, and then wasn't quite hoppy enough to a lot of people's standards, what they expect from a hazy these days, because they just seem to keep getting hoppier and hoppier. So we added a second round of dry hopping to the recipe, and now it's double dry hopped Perfectly Hazy. We use Citra and Mosaic, which are, I mean, the fruitiest and the most impactful hops probably there are out there, and just a really good combo to give you a juicy orange juice kind of flavor, low bitterness, hop flavor. So yeah, that's probably been our best-selling kit for the past couple of years. We did have another question here that Ben posted earlier on the event page here. Ben Strong, he asked, how do you plan hop schedules for New England IPAs, specifically primary fermentation hop additions? How does the hazy conversion and the juicy flavor differ day to day? That's an interesting topic that there's a lot of research going on right now. A lot of breweries have their own kind of process, or I have my own process that I've gotten used to. I've tried a few different methods for the hazies. Like I said, I like that big end of boil addition followed by like 160 degree addition into the kettle. And then what a lot of people do is add some hops. Well, you cool down, pitch your yeast, give the beer a day or two to really start fermenting. And once the krausen, which is the foam above the beer in the fermenter, once that looks like it's very high, it's at high krausen, meaning it's at the peak of its activity. You want to dump in I don't go crazy with this addition. I just do an ounce, maybe two, just loose, dump them right into the fermenter. Loose, you don't have to bag them or anything because they're going to kind of move around. The yeast is going to kind of play with the hops and move them around and go through this this conversion called biotransformation, where that's the yeast is interacting with compounds in the hops and turning them from one compound to another. And this is something that's still kind of mysterious, but they're starting to like learn more things about what you'd look for in a hop specifically to be able to predict the kind of flavor it's going to biotransform into. So if you're really curious about stuff like this, there's a book called The New IPA by Scott Janish, who has a really cool blog. He's now a professional brewer in Maryland. He wrote about all these different compounds and hops and what oils to look for if you're looking for certain biotransformation flavors. Like there's certain compounds and hops that may just be citrusy if they're added after fermentation, but if you add them during fermentation, you may get these tropical like passion fruit kind of flavors out of specific hop varieties. So there's lots of stuff being learned about that, and it's kind of interesting to see that stuff develop. Stan Hieronymus has a newsletter he sends out once a month that I read every time it comes out because there's always some cool new research that he shares with the homebrew community, and all like actual analytical data that they do, mostly out of like Oregon State University, because that's where a lot of hops are grown. So there's a lot of cool data coming out of that school, particularly in Oregon. So that's kind of day to day. I usually will just do that first dry hop to give it the biotransformation. Also tends to leave the beer with a more stable haze, so it won't end up dropping clear after sitting in the keg or in the bottle for a couple weeks. That's another reason to dry hop during fermentation. And then I'll do another, usually a much larger dry hop addition 3 days before I'm going to end up packaging the beer, whether it's going into a keg or into bottles. So that's kind of my standard dry hop procedure. And I'm usually talking somewhere between 10 and 16 ounces total for a hazy IPA is kind of, it sounds ridiculous, but that's really what it takes to get that really juicy flavor from your hops and to make that beer just pop out of the glass and smell like a glass of orange juice or tropical fruit juice or something like that. They're expensive. That's why they're $20 for a 4-pack at the bottle shop or something. But that's just what it takes to make this crazy style of IPA. Tom Manning, do some more trial runs with water, measure. Yeah, I think that's the best thing you can do to be able to kind of predict what your boil off rate is going to be. But it's something that's good to know, especially if you're brewing in the same system over and over, just to know how much to start with in order to hit the right volume once you're done boiling. So we talked a lot about hops. Does anyone have any questions about yeast? I'd like to see some questions about yeast because that's, I think, another really fun part of writing a recipe, because it's the yeast that actually makes beer. We just kind of create the wort, and then the yeast turns that wort into beer. Said that 1,000 times, but I still think it's completely true. Andrew here has a question. Let's see what it says. Hi, is there a general rule or formula to convert or to use when a recipe calls for an amount of hops using pellets, processed versus fresh? So yeah, there's a lot of different ways to calculate how much hops to use. I've seen some old ones on some older recipes called AAU, which is alpha acid units, which every time someone asks me about that, I always have to look it up again and figure out how to calculate that. But most of the time, recipes now are just written 1 ounce of this at this time, but you do have to kind of check on your alpha acids. So I think you're mostly asking about how much hops to use for homegrown hops compared to commercial or pelletized hops. That can be tricky. What I always recommend for, especially when we get a lot of people doing backyard hopped IPAs, like hops from their yard, from their garden, I always recommend using those hops later in the boil, mostly just for flavor and aroma. And that's mostly because you don't know what your alpha acid is on those hops. It's going to fall in a range, but some varieties have kind of wider ranges. Like a lot of people grow Cascade around here. It does well around here. It's an American hop. So it can fall anywhere from 4 to 8% alpha acid, maybe even I've seen it a little bit higher. So that can actually be a pretty big difference in the IBUs you'd get if you add 1 ounce of a 4% alpha at 60 minutes. You'll get something like 15 IBUs. But if it was 8% alpha acid, it would double the IBUs, and that would kind of maybe give you more bitterness than you'd want in that recipe. So I don't usually recommend using them for bittering. I usually recommend buy an ounce of something like a Columbus or Centennial or something like that for a homegrown hopped pale ale or IPA, and just know what kind of IBUs you're going to get, and then throw those whole cone hops from your yard in like anywhere from 15 minutes or less, or at the end of the boil is kind of nice too. That way you retain as much of the flavor and aroma of the hops, because there is kind of a give and take. The longer you boil the hop, the more bitterness you extract, but at the same time, the aroma and flavor is kind of being boiled off to a certain extent. So that's kind of, I'd recommend just going with your homegrown hops at the end of the boil, or 10 minutes or less, 15 minutes or less. Retain as much flavor of that, because that's kind of what you're going for. You want to know what those hops you just grew, spent all that time harvesting, are actually going to give you in terms of flavor and all that. If I answered that question, let me know. Otherwise, I can try a little harder. Bill Carlton asked, what is your favorite yeast for New England IPA, any IPA? I always like the London Ale 3 from Yeast, which is also from Omega. It's OYL 011, or they call it British Ale 5, Roman numeral 5. So that one is like the kind of the quintessential hazy IPA yeast. I haven't found any other strain that is more reliable in terms of giving you the stable haze, and also just giving you that kind of ester profile, which is like the fruity compounds that yeast create when they ferment. That yeast just tends to give like a very fruit bowl, fruit cup kind of smell, along with like this hint of vanilla that I get, especially if you ferment it at the high end of its range. So I just think that yeast it can't be beat for the hazy style. I've tried a couple others, like the DIPA yeast from Omega 052. That one's really nice, but it does tend to drop clear after a little bit of time in the keg or in the bottles, which, I mean, it's not the end of the world. It's still going to taste very similar, but it just won't look like orange juice in your glass. Maybe after a couple weeks it sits in the bottle or in the keg. So that's a big reason why I like that London Ale 3, they call it, which is Omega British Ale 5 or Yeast 1318. It's a very vigorous fermenter too, so you always have to be careful not to blow the top off of your fermenter when using that. It just goes crazy. Ferments. It's a top cropping yeast, so it creates a lot of krausen, and it wants to blow out the top sometimes. So Ben Strong has another question. He asks, what yeast is good to stress for fun, unique flavors? That's a really cool question. I like stressing a lot of Saison yeast personally is my favorite to kind of treat improperly. It's kind of accustomed to that, I think. A lot of the Saison yeast used to ferment without temperature control and just get really warm. And by doing that, they create more flavor that you expect from a Saison. Especially the French Saison is very attenuative. It ferments pretty much all the sugars you're going to put at it. It's going to go from pretty much any starting gravity all the way down to close to zero. It has a gene in it, the STA1 gene. It's called a diastaticus. So it's actually not just pure brewer's yeast. There's this diastaticus stuff that's in Saison, French Saison yeast, that causes it to ferment a lot more sugars than a standard brewer's yeast. So I really like to stress out Saison yeast. There's also the tropical IPA yeast. I know Dan Berger here at the shop likes that one quite a bit. And he likes to ferment it warm, like 80 to 85 degrees. And by doing that with that specific strain of yeast, you really accentuate the fruity pineapple flavors that yeast can give. And then, of course, there's all the newer, at least new to us in this market, the Kveik yeast from Norway, Norwegian farmhouse ale yeast. Those are just freaky yeast that the more you torture them, the better the beer is going to come out, or the more character at least you'll get out of that strain. There's 4, 5, 6 different strains now available from Omega, and we have pretty much all of them in stock all the time. They've become very popular. They allow a lot of people to ferment wherever and not have to really worry about temp control. There's the Voss Kveik yeast is probably my favorite. That one is very citrusy. It will ferment at 90 to 100 to 110 degrees hot and not give you any weird off flavors. It actually gets even more flavorful at those higher ranges, and it'll be done fermenting in 1 or 2 days, which is very strange. It goes against everything we've learned about yeast for the past, I don't know, century or 2 or 3. So it's kind of, it feels wrong using that stuff, but it's what you're supposed to do apparently to get all the character out of that yeast. So I got one here from Dan Berger. What's a good resource for figuring out best fermentation temperatures for various yeasts and various styles? Also, is there a good resource for investigating step mashing and how it changes the fermentability and mouthfeel of a beer? So the first part of that question, good question, Dan. Good resource, figuring out fermentation temps for different strains, for different styles. Every yeast laboratory is going to have all that information on their website, and Omega now actually puts it on every package of yeast for every strain. Every strain of yeast is going to have kind of 4 main attributes to it that you might want to investigate before selecting that yeast. I'd say flocculation is it measures how well that yeast drops out of suspension, basically how clear it's going to leave your beer at the end. That is something to look at if you want clear or cloudy. You asked about temperatures specifically. So yeah, every yeast strain has an ideal temperature range that is going to be given to you on the Omega package, or for Y yeast, you have to look on their website. But they'll give you those ranges. And I mean, most ale yeasts are going to fall somewhere between 64 and 72. I usually aim for like the middle of that range, like 68 fermentation temperatures for ales. Lagers anywhere from like 48 to mid 50s. There is one lager strain though, true lager strain, that actually can go up to like the mid 60s and still end up having a nice clean crisp flavor. And that's the 2124 or Omega German Lager 1. That's the original kind of lager strain from Weinstefan in Germany. That one is good anywhere from like 48 to 65, but I tend to go cooler if I can, just to give it the cleanest, crispest flavor possible, because I like crispy lagers. And then second part of the question, is there a good resource for investigating step mashing and how it changes the fermentability and mouthfeel of a beer? So I've done some step mashing, but very simplified step mashing where it's just 2 temperature ranges I hit. And that's basically to hit a beta rest in the mid 140s to give a nice fermentability, and then mid to upper 150s to finish off the mash. And you can do that with a fancy mash tun, or you can do it by just adding boiling water to your mash tun to heat it up. And so doing those step mashes kind of gives you the best of both worlds in terms of making the beer fermentable and want to end up being dry and letting the yeast ferment most of those sugars. But then doing that higher step up tends to enhance the mouthfeel and not leave the beer watery or anything like that. So for resources, that's a good question. I don't know. I kind of just picked that up after reading a lot of stuff online, but we can do some research and maybe post a good resource on step mashing and
it's
what it kind of does for the beer and how to do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussions out there. Do you need it? Do you not need it? And I'm not going to jump in because I don't know what you just talked about. I apologize. Welcome back. Hey, how you doing?
I tend to just stick with a single infusion mash. It's done me well for years. Jack had a question that's kind of where I was getting to next. Jack asks, hi, Jack, by the way. What's the oddest thing you've put into a beer?
Intentionally or unintentionally? I used to brew outside a lot. Had some really interesting things fly in.
I put black pepper in my Saison. It's not crazy, but it's like always have it in the cupboard. So I was brewing a Saison with a yeast that has these peppery notes to it. So I figured to accentuate it, I just put some fresh cracked black pepper at the end of the boil. I don't tend to get very weird with my recipes, to be honest.
My strangest, most unique thing would be maple water.
Yeah,
a friend and a customer used to tap maple trees, and so before boiling them down to syrup, we would just use all the sap as the brewing water and sub it one for one. So my brewing water would start at like 10 before I even added grain. That was one of the most fun beers I think I've done because it doesn't necessarily taste like maple, but it does do some really fun things. And that was before Nelson Sauvin was really we couldn't give it away in the beginning. So it's a Nelson Sauvin Belgian Ardennes maple sap beer. And that was probably one of the most craziest things I've done. And that was fun. And it's different every year. It's like a vintage. You just don't know what the sugars are going to be when you pull it from the tree and things like that. A really fun resource, which I'll try to pull up is, the Homebrewers Cookbook from Almanac. Sorry, thank you. From Scratch Brewing in Southern Illinois.
Yeah,
they do some really awesome things. I remember sitting on a seminar with them. Let me pull this up here. They do some really cool things, like some really old school ways, and really they go out and forage for ingredients for their beers.
I've used wine must in an IPA before that. I was just remembering that. I used some Sauvignon Blanc juice in a brewed IPA that we had at the Mundelein Beer Fest 3 years ago or something like that. That was, for me, that was weird.
Yeah.
Or odd, I guess.
I'll post this one. This one's fun. I listened to them at one of the homebrew conferences in Minneapolis. Texas too long. Hold please.
I saw Matt had a question about how often do you start building your recipe based on your yeast choice. I like that idea. That's a cool way to start because there's lots of different strains from lots of different parts of the world that are going to hugely influence the flavor of the beer, how well it's going to ferment, how dry it's going to end up, how clear it should end up. And then there's a fun little fact here. There's 950 flavor compounds in beer, and 400 of them come from yeast. So the yeast is important to pick out the right one, and it is a good place to start. especially if you got an old pack that's lying around that you got to brew something with. But a lot of times we have some yeast that's like getting close to being expired. So I kind of force myself to brew something with that yeast and look, you can look up the yeast strain on the laboratory's website, Yeast Omega, and they'll give you a bunch of styles that work well with that yeast, or what that yeast is really traditionally used to ferment what style of beer. So that is a really good place to actually start for writing a recipe.
And one of the really interesting things we have is that if you go to, what is it, either White Labs or I know Omega down in the city is going to start doing it. They're having a tap room where they'll make the same beer, but they'll highlight all their different yeasts with the same beer, and you kind of taste the differences. I think they have their tap room in Asheville that has it. I know they do out in California,
in San Diego, and Asheville too. I think,
and then Omega's doing that downtown, I think.
There's no timeline for that right now, but
so we'll see. But that's one of the things which would be really, really cool. But yeah, great question.
Another good question from Ben Strong. What beers benefit the most from a step mash? I think Pilsners are really, most lagers. I think Pilsners,
heavy,
a lot of Belgian styles. And that's mostly to get the beer to fully ferment out nice and dry, but still not have it end up tasting watery. I think that's the main goal of a step mash, especially when you're just doing the beta rest and the alpha rest. So it makes it super fermentable with the beta rest, which is in the lower temp range, like 145-ish. And then your beta rests like mid to upper 150s, maybe even low 160s. So it's really like light, crisp, dry, somewhat medium to full bodied beers are kind of good step mash.
Do you ever do a rest anymore at that 112, 113 range anymore? Because there's been a lot of people that don't do. Anyway, okay, never mind. We won't talk about that then.
I haven't.
Yeah.
And protein.
It's really good.
They're really good.
The yeast starters. Did you get that one? Mm-hmm. Okay. So from Jason, yeast starters, do you always do them, or is there a certain OG that you make one? So there's the textbook answer, and then there's what we try to do. Textbook answer is always any beer that has a gravity above 1050, 1055. You should always do a starter or multiple packs. I think there's very few beers when properly designed and prepared for that we don't do a starter for. There's definitely some that will just kind of like, oh, we'll just throw a couple packs of yeast in and be done with it and not worry about it. But I think it's very important to get your yeast going, get it active. Even with yeast that is fresh, sometimes it doesn't do what you want it to do, and doing a starter saves you that effort of having to start over or do it that way. Plus, your lag phase is a lot slower or a lot faster, so fermentation starts a lot sooner, which is good for the safety of the beer and other reasons. Mm-hmm. I'm sure Ryan will expound upon.
Yeah, I don't always do starters, but I do a lot of the times.
Yeah.
I brew lots of lagers lately, so if you're going to get into lagers, you got to do starters if you're using the liquid yeast. Dry lager yeast is not as cheap as dry ale yeast. It actually is almost the same price, so you can't really save much just by buying a second pack of dry lager yeast. So starters are huge for lagers. I do them anything. I think Omega actually recommends to do a starter if it's 1060 or above.
Okay.
Y yeast is 1050. That's just difference of laboratory recommendations.
I think it's the consistency of yeast cell count in each packet.
Yeah,
potentially.
And freshness, manufacture date is a huge thing to check. Omega recommends doing one even if it's below 1060 if the yeast pack is 3 months, between 3 and 6 months. Y yeast, I don't think they really cover that on their recommendations. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But and one other thing, Y yeast recently switched to Best By dates instead of packaged on dates.
Yes. It's caught me a few times.
It's kind of strange.
Yeah. They've changed it, which makes it easier for us. It's harder for us to keep inventory on fresher yeast because I'm used to the old way where it says, but anyway. But yeah, I think the answer to that one is whenever possible, do a yeast starter. You'll be happy. But there's definitely times where you won't. But You want to.
Maybe saisons and stuff. You don't really have to.
Right. Or even some of the hefties, I guess, some of the ones where you want a little bit less yeast, a smaller yeast cell count, maybe not hefties in particular, but a lot of times to drive up some flavor. That's one of the things too you can always play around with is if you do yeast starters to calculate yeast pitch rates, and you can do some variations based on what your yeast pitch rates are to get some different flavors and things like that. So good question. Okay. I know I've been talking as long as you, but
Michael has another question. How important to you are flaked oats to milkshake IPAs? Are they necessary? I think they are. I brewed 2 or 3 milkshakes, and based on every recipe I've ever seen, they typically have quite a bit of flaked oats, like a crazy amount, like between 20 and 30% of your total grain bill is flaked oats. It just gives it that creamy texture, which you'd expect from a milkshake of any type.
Yeah.
So lots of oats, a good amount of lactose, and a little bit of hops, and lots of fruit puree typically is what I see in milkshakes.
Yeah. Here's another question, Ryan. It's a great question. Thank you for bringing this up. Do you do yeast starter with the Quebec strains?
That is a good question. For the new Lutra yeast, I think you might want to, if you really want it to come out clean and pseudo lager like. I haven't had a chance to even use that yet, but
I've used it once.
I think they recommend pitching it like a normal ale as opposed to like a lager yeast. So I'd probably do a starter with that if I really wanted a nice clean lager that I could ferment at 70 degrees. I'd still probably do a starter with that. I probably wouldn't for Voss or Hornindal or Espy or any of the other strains besides Lucha, really. But a couple things with those strains is they are very nutrient dependent and oxygen dependent. So you'll have that fast fermentation if you ferment it hot, but also give it a little nutrient. And if you're able to oxygenate, that's always very good for the Kvike strains. I know they do like to get tortured, but if you're going for like a big beer with them, I'd still recommend some nutrient and some oxygen.
Yeah. And then Tom, yes, flaked oats, and don't forget rice hulls. Yes. Very, very good. Yes, because you don't want to. There's a lot of things you have to do if you get a Stuck Spark. Oh, that's our dragon in the back, in case you heard that. Wow, that scared me. I don't know where he left off as far as questions. We've been at it for about an hour now. I don't know if you guys can listen to us talk.
Yeah, we hit all the questions there.
Cool.
Remember these two here made it through malt, hops, and yeast. We didn't really talk about water, but maybe that could be another topic.
Water could almost be another
whole hour.
Yeah,
at least.
Yeah. But I think we got those. That was fantastic, folks. We're gonna wrap it up. If there are any other topics that you'd like to see us talk about, send us an email, make comments below in this live stream. Shoot us an email, things like that, because there's a lot of things we can't talk about, and there's a lot of things that we want to know what you're interested in listening to us talk about. So I think let us know. We're going to be doing this again, and probably the next 3 to 4 weeks, we will put another reminder out there. There's even topics if we want to switch it up. We're going into a wine season, so we'll think about that. We don't know. There's some cheese we could talk about. There's more topics with beer.
Those will be led by Andy, the cheese and the wine.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, Tim, here's a good one. We'll finish up with this one, and then we'll have to say goodnight. So that way we could talk all day. But Tim just said, what's all this talk about enzymes?
Oh, enzymes.
That's a tough one to end on, because that could be another.
Yeah. Which enzymes are we talking about? Oh, in the step mashing and all that, or I forget when I mentioned enzymes. Did I talk about enzymes? They do all the work in the mash pretty much, and convert starch into sugar. But there are some anything that ends with an ASE is basically an enzyme, like alpha amylase or glucoamylase. Those are all enzymes, and they do a lot of the work for us, and they're just kind of built into malt kernels and stuff like that.
That's something we may have to discuss on another topic another day, perhaps. Good question though. But we're going to sign off and say thank you. If here's another thing too. If anyone wants to know when we're doing our next one, click the link here or go to our website, subscribe to our newsletter. That's where we generally let people know first when we're having our next event, as well as following us on Facebook and now YouTube. This is live streaming on YouTube, which is the first for us, which is exciting. But
Sweet.
give us a call at the store, send us an email. Here's our web address. I'm Andy. This is Ryan. We'll talk to you guys later.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.